I didn't even drink coffee till 4 years ago, So what I used to drink 4 years ago was that thing we don't mention where we just put it in hot water and milk and it becomes coffee. We don't use those words here, but that's really what I used to drink. So it's I think a story of a couple of sort of accidental turns here and there, which is how I sort of landed up here. But it is the story of coffee, I think, is just one of those amazing stories that involves everything. So it involves lies and deception and, arms and guns and exploitation and all of the other good stuff as well, which is what we're here to share. So coffee has transformed the world. We drink 1.5 billion cups of coffee every day. And that coffee is now being immensely threatened. So we're reaching a position where, because of climate, so coffee as a plant needs a stable environment. By stable environment, we mean reasonably stable temperatures, water, soil, and all of the other things that go into making coffee, production happen, including things like insects. And coffee needs a stable environment, but we see bad weather ahead. And so the future of coffee itself is threatened. So imagine a world without coffee. We're talking about 50, 60 years almost where coffees like the Arabicas may be actually completely wiped out, particularly from India. And not just that, imagine no rainforest, imagine no birds, imagine really fluctuating temperatures, droughts, floods, and all of these things come when we grow coffee in ways that leave behind irreversibly damaging impact on the environment. Imagine digesting this bleak reality without your morning cup of coffee. Yeah? So that's what we're talking about. But let's start at a somewhat happier place. Coffee was discovered in the early 11th century in Ethiopia by a goat herd by the name of Kaldi. So this is Kaldi, who used to take his goats out into the forest, the mountain sort of forest, and found that one day his goats were behaving a little funny. And were restless at night, were, much more jumpy than usual. So he followed them around the next couple of weeks and found that they were actually chomping on some unidentified berries, which he took back home and boiled in some water and discovered coffee. So coffee was earlier drunk just by boiling fruit in water, and it was thought to have medicinal properties. From Ethiopia, coffee went out of Ethiopia to Yemen, to a town called Mocha, which is how we now know of the coffee mocha, right? So the town in Yemen called Mocha is where coffee went out, and then from there to Turkey. So coffee was popularized in Turkey, and it became so popular in Turkey that people started opening coffee houses and cafes. And the Turkish coffee house really became a sort of really bustling place for people to get together and talk. So much so that actually the Ottoman Sultan Murad III banned coffee. He prohibited the consumption of coffee, and he shut down almost every coffee house in Turkey, right? And this was because he, thought that coffee was an intoxicant and that people shouldn't be consuming intoxicants. But houses also became a place where dissidents would get together, friends would talk about overthrowing policies and overthrowing the government, and he didn't want that. So coffee houses became a place for political discussions that any ruler didn't want. And it wasn't just in Turkey. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church also prohibited coffee. So very ironically, the birthplace of coffee in India birthplace of coffee in the world was where coffee was also prohibited, right? And this And in fact, I think the count is that almost like 10,000-15,000 people were actually thrown into the river, as far as I know, because they consumed coffee or were seen in coffee houses. And this major prohibition of coffee in the Arab world really forced coffee out into Europe. So that's how coffee went from Turkey to Vienna to Paris to Italy, where really, the coffee culture and so on really sort of started thriving. Coffee in India came from Mecca. So at this time, it was also illegal to smuggle or trade in, it was illegal to trade in green beans of coffee, yeah? So you weren't allowed to trade green beans and take them out of the Arab world. So what this rather, brave sort of Sufi saint, Baba Budan, we've heard of him, he did was smuggled 7 coffee beans out of Mecca and brought them to India and planted that stock in the current Baba Budangiri Hills. So the Baba Budangiri Hills and all of the coffee that we have in India comes from a stock of 7 beans, which is really quite magnificent. But coffee was only sort of systematically planted later in the sort of mid-18th century by the East India Company and the British. But we've had it since the sort of 17th century, but people kept it in their gardens and so on. And all of that comes from 7 beans, which is really the most fascinating story. Okay, so what we do see though is that, as coffee spread across the world, starting from Ethiopia, you find that coffee farms and forests overlapped almost identically. So whether you look at the South and Central Americas through the Amazon, the Ethiopian and Kenyan highlands, all across Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, as well as in India, the Western Ghats. So the Western Ghats is where coffee is grown in India. So we see that as one of the 2 really big biodiversity hotspots, the other one being the Northeast. But so we grow coffee in what is also the best forest in India. Which means that, of course, coffee farms and coffee production has impacted forest. And this is where I think, the link to climate really comes in. Because as conservation people, when we approach climate, we do that through forests. So we know that forests are extremely important in maintaining stable environments. So forests act as sinks for carbon, but they also regulate water, they regulate temperature. So all of these things really kind of buffer against any kind of climatic change. So when you remove forest, you're really also contributing massively to changing climate. So all throughout this morning's talk, whenever I talk about forests or whenever I talk about trees, I'm also sort of pushing that link to saying, there is changing climate because of what we do. So coffee farms have impacted forests, right? And how have they impacted forests? So look at this picture. I don't know whether you all can see it clearly, but sort of come up front if you have to. It's really important. So this is a picture of the largest single coffee holding in the world. It's in Brazil. And if you see this picture, what you see is very different from the picture of shade coffee that we showed you earlier, where the coffee that we were serving in the filter comes from. This has absolutely no trees, so it's just a flattish piece of land with just coffee till the eye can see, pretty much. And this is what coffee farms in Brazil have done, and Brazil is the largest producer of coffee globally. This is also Brazil, a similar picture, just rows and rows of coffee. No trees at all. This is coffee in Kenya. So this is the Kenyan highland coffee. Again, just coffee. You don't see any other kind of tree at all. This is what a coffee farm in Colombia looks like. Again, just hillsides of coffee, right? So this looks very much like, if any of you have been to the Nilgiris or the Annamalais or looked at tea plantations in India, they look like this. So just rolling hills of coffee. If I stand on top of one hill, I can see the other, right? And of course, this is the picture we showed you earlier. This is Costa Rica. So again, what coffee farms in Costa Rica look like. This is West Java. So this looks a little different. You can see some trees, but what you do see is that they're kind of few. There are not many trees. But the trees also look the same. So this is what we call as a single species of tree, right? So it's just this coffee, and then there's just one other kind of tree that looks like it's been planted. And this is Vietnam, right? So another really emerging large producer of coffee. Again, coffee grown directly under the sun. Now, if you compare that to what we grow coffee in India, or what we used to grow coffee in India like, this is what coffee in India looks like, kind of, in some places. There's a caveat. So coffee in India started off where we actually didn't cut the forest down, like in many other parts of the world, whether Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, wherever. We interplanted coffee inside the forest. So what we did is we cleared the undergrowth of all the shrubs and all of the other things you see, and we planted coffee there. But we retained the trees. And we retained the trees for a couple of very different, very important reasons. Firstly, the early coffee planters believed that trees played a really important role in coffee production. So that trees actually buffered climate in a farm. So if you had, in India, we have really long periods of drought. We don't get rain for most of the year. And actually coffee and trees, because of the canopy, actually retain moisture in the soil. So your plants don't get stressed out. And that's why we kept trees. The other reason we kept trees is because a lot of parts of where coffee is grown, people actually had sacred beliefs associated with the forest. So in many parts, they have, in a lot of parts of Coorg, you have a very long and rich history of sacred groves, which means that every village has a temple, and every temple has a sacred forest where is the resting place of deities, it's the resting place of ancestors, and people didn't actually go in and cut trees from there. So trees were seen as a very sacred part of the landscape. So we didn't actually cut them down. But things are changing, and what you see much more increasingly across all of the coffee landscapes in Coorg, so in India, so coffee is grown in Coorg, Chikmagalur, BR Hills, the Annamalais, Araku Valley, and now, even in parts of the northeast, what you see is coffee farms with almost no trees at all. So this looks really different. If we just go back to the picture before, this is shade coffee, so coffee grown under shade, and then this is coffee grown with very little shade, so no trees at all, or a single type of tree. And what we've done very much in India is we've grown a tree called silver oak, which is a tree that people actually have the legal right to harvest. So we have very interesting laws in our country where you can own the land but not the trees on your land. So as a farmer, I'm not really allowed to cut down a forest tree without a whole set of permissions and taxes and so on paid to the government. But if I plant silver oak, which is a commercially valuable tree actually imported from Australia, so it's exotic, we call that exotic. Exotic trees I can cut down with no permissions needed. So I think, a lot of sort of economic incentives or reasons why I'd want to keep a commercially valuable tree that I can harvest, right? So people have started growing coffee under silver oak. Or what we do is, if we do have farms that have trees, we shade regulate, it's called. So you remove the branches of the trees to such a degree that really this looks like pretty comical, right? You just have a sort of tree stump with a little clump of leaves at the top. So why do people do this? Why have we gotten rid of the trees on our farms despite having had them right in the beginning, right? Well, so shade, and so by trees I mean shade. So tree canopy, and that provides shade, right? So in coffee lingo we call it shade trees. So when I talk about shade, I mean trees, and I mean forest trees, not exotic trees, right? So there's a very interesting relationship between shade and coffee, right? So shade, if I want to increase the yield on my farm, so more coffee from my farm, as any rational farmer would want to, I actually have to reduce the shade. So coffee doesn't naturally do very well under shade, which is why, in parts of the world where they've really cramped up their production, they don't have shade. Brazil doesn't have shade, Vietnam doesn't have shade. Their productivity is massive, right? But if I want to keep shade because I want to follow sustainable practices, I want to buffer or mitigate the impacts of climate change, then my yields suffer quite dramatically. So I think, if you maintain something like more than 40% shade cover, so actually you can go out and measure what shade cover is, I face almost a 25% decrease in yield, right? So it's quite significant. As a farmer, I face significant trade-offs. I might want to follow sustainable farming practices, but I do face a dilemma. But just sort of to rewind also a little bit, basically there are 4 ways to grow coffee, and all of these involve shade. So shade is the most critical thing when we think about sustainability, coffee production and everything. The first is wild coffee, which just means that I have coffee in a forest. The only place actually where they do grow coffee like this is in Ethiopia, where coffee was discovered in the first place. So I have a few coffee trees in the forest, and I can go and harvest it if I want and so on. But it's never going to be sort of economically viable for me. Yeah. The next way of growing coffee is something called rustic coffee, and this is the kind of coffee practice that a lot of the work that I do actually focuses on, which is that we try and maintain a balance between keeping shade, following sustainable practices, conserving biodiversity, and then also trying to make it economically viable for farms to grow coffee. So that's rustic. Technified coffee is what I showed you a picture of earlier. So coffee grown with silver oak, right? So just coffee and then one other species of tree, right? So, and in India, it's most commonly silver oak. In other parts of Uganda, Rwanda, it's bananas, and so on. And that's the picture I showed you from Java. So just one other tree with coffee. And then finally, I suppose the worst way to grow coffee, the one that has the most significant impact on climate, is to remove all trees totally. So coffee grown under the sun, right? Yields are massive, but you also need a lot of inputs, you need a lot of fertilizer, you need a lot of pesticides, and you're completely dramatically changing the landscape. So look at Brazil, no shade at all. Okay, so just to borrow from Twitter, when we think of biodiversity, when we think of sustainability, when we think of climate, the most sustainable way to grow coffee is wild coffee, and the least sustainable way to grow coffee is sun coffee. So the kind of work that I do sort of attempts at bringing about a rustic kind of production practice. Okay, the interesting thing is that this is not all gloom and doom. People have discovered, scientists discovered that biodiversity was being lost from coffee farms and that coffee production was impacting climate change and so on. About 20 years ago, maybe actually a little bit more, 25 years ago. And starting from North America, people started developing mechanisms to address it, right? So a lot of conscientious consumers, coffee drinkers, didn't want their coffee to be accompanied by like a sip of guilt, right? So I didn't want as a coffee drinker to feel guilty that my cup of coffee was destroying rainforest, was impacting the environment, was exploiting people. So we started something called certifications, right? So certifications are mechanisms that are implemented all over the world. The most common ones that you might have heard of are things like fair trade. So fair trade is a certification, organic is a certification. Environmentally, the big certifications are things like Rainforest Alliance. So just to give you an idea, all of Costa Coffee in Bangalore is Rainforest Alliance certified. All of McDonald's coffee in Bangalore is Rainforest Alliance certified, right? So Rainforest Alliance is the big environmental certification. So certifications and labels attempt to, I suppose, assure consumers that their coffee comes from a sustainable source, right? So organic, right? Everybody has bought organic products before, right? What is organic certification? Why do we want organic? Why do we buy organic tea or coffee? Okay, free of chemicals, whether it's chemical pesticides or fertilizers. Okay, free of GMOs, genetic modified organisms. Okay, what else? It's grown in the way it was supposed to be grown, so much more traditional practices. Okay, do we buy it out of guilt? Do we buy it out of wanting to feel better? Smugness? Smugness? Do we buy it out of health? Do we think it's healthier? Or do we buy it, genuinely sort of, we care about where our food comes from? We as consumers are beginning to think about where our things come from. And we rely on certifications, right? Is it feasible to expect you to go to the factory where soap is made to check it out? Not really, right? So we rely on things that we think tell us the truth of the process, whether it's fair trade or organic or whatever. What we find in reality, though, is that there's a disconnect between what these labels tell us and what the fine print is. So they're true. They tell you pretty much the truth, but they don't tell you, I suppose, the complexity or the nuance in between, right? So when you look at certifications for coffee, you find that a lot of farms that, as a conservation person or as an environmentalist, I'd say are pretty darn unsustainable, are certified as sustainable coffee. And that's quite peculiar. So if you look at this picture, all of the farms that I showed you earlier, right, whether there are no trees at all, whether it's really heavily modified shade, modified trees, or a single tree, are actually sold as sustainable coffee to naive consumers. Right? So this is also a process where I guess I'm asking you as consumers, how much effort do we actually put into finding out what the fine print is? And how naive should we continue to be? Right? So simply labeling isn't enough. And we see labels everywhere. Sometimes you find coffees with 3 labels. So it can be Rainforest Line certified, Fair Trade certified, and UTZ certified or whatever. And that's like, you're being bombarded by things that attempt to tell you that it's sustainable. But is it really? That's the sort of big question. So I don't know whether you know. So you mentioned direct trade. So direct trade is a certification. FSC is a huge certification. So FSC is the Forest Stewardship Council. So I'm just deviating, but just, if you're interested. So if you buy wood or you buy furniture that's FSC certified, it means that the wood in the furniture that you're buying actually comes from a sustainable source. So the trees or the timber has been harvested sustainably, yeah? So globally, that's huge. So we actually export, I think, a lot of FSC certified wood to Europe. MSC, we don't have MSC here, Marine Stewardship Council. So if we eat shellfish or any kind of fish, I don't know, that's MSC certified, it means that it's coming from a sustainably harvested source. We're not overfishing in these areas where it's coming in. So, the rest of the world really cares about certifications. We kind of care about fair trade, we mostly just care about organic. But the rest of the world really has gotten going on these certification things. So I suppose what I'm arguing is that labeling and global certifications aren't enough. Maybe the fact that certifications haven't picked up in India is a really great starting point to do something much more meaningful, right? A much more local, meaningful solution to address some of the environmental problems or social problems that maybe we understand, but somebody implementing certification doesn't. Okay, so this is the sort of starting point of why we started the work that we're doing. This organization, the sort of objective is to support farms to adopt sustainable practices, and we were very young. So part of the reason to talk to you about it is to actually seek your feedback or to seek your criticism on what we're doing. Because we haven't figured out whether we have the answers. Right? So the first sort of objective that we have is to take Technified and Sun farms and support them to become much more rustic. And we do that through a partnership with coffee growers. And we've started in Coorg because that's the landscape we know best. But the idea is to look all across coffee landscapes in India. And just to really simply tell you, so imagine that this is the farm. what we're doing is basically starting micro enterprises, right? So small scale businesses that look at harvesting coffee from a block of the farm which follows certain practices. And that includes keeping things like 100 trees an acre, keeping 60% shade cover, maintaining a diversity of trees, reducing chemical fertilizer, completely prohibiting chemical pesticides, and basically doing all the things we can to improve wildlife habitat, right? Because we started off, as I said, as conservationists. And what do farms get in return? Well, we market their coffee, so we do a lot of value addition. If you look at the way coffee is basically traded in India, there's two problems, right? So the first problem is that most of what we drink is mud. I'm so sorry to tell you the truth, but it's true. We drink very poor quality coffee. 70% of our coffee is exported. What remains is, it's called browns, blacks, and bits, right? So really the mud, twigs, wood, everything that's harvested is actually roasted and ground up and served to you as coffee. So we have a major problem with drinking quality coffee, or sourcing quality coffee. And the second problem is that we don't think about sustainability. So what we're trying to do in some ways is to address both. So is it possible to produce good quality coffee, but also produce it in ways that are sustainable, in ways that conserve biodiversity, and in ways that mitigate the impacts of climate change, right? So, there's much more price security and livelihood security for farms, but then in return, what we want is increased conservation. That's pretty much, I think, where I'm going to stop, but I'm going to ask two questions that I have in my mind. How do you actually get in the heads of coffee drinkers around the city, around the country, and tell them that it matters where their coffee comes from or how their coffee is grown? So how do we do it? I call it social advocacy, but really, how do you get in the heads of people and tell them that it's important? That's the first question. The second question is, as someone who's actually doing this every day, this is a headache, trying to, as I said, we started off as academics and researchers. I didn't think I'd be selling coffee. I certainly don't want to sell coffee as it's just a means to an end. So we see selling coffee from these kinds of farms as a means to do conservation. If we don't end up doing conservation, we don't want to sell coffee. But really, it's a lot of calisthenics just to ensure that we follow sustainable practices. Is there another way? So, I'm sure with climate, it's really sort of picking up, and I'm sure you guys know of what carbon credits and so on are. On the farm, what it means is that, let's say I'm a conservation organization, a conservation NGO. Instead of doing all this calisthenics and headache stuff about, sourcing coffee, figuring out that it's good quality, making it compete as a product with Starbucks or Costa Coffee or Coffee Day or whatever, things that we're certainly not skilled to do, what I might do is approach a farm and tell them, I'm going to pay you a certain amount for the number of trees you have on your farm, right? So if you have 100 trees an acre, I pay you 10,000 rupees a year. That's a really, really popular way of doing conservation these days. So a lot of places, it's hugely popular in places like Costa Rica. So it's known technically as something called payments for environmental services, PES, right? Payments for environmental services. So I can pay a whole bunch of farms in Coorg and Chikmagalur 10,000 rupees for every 100 trees they have. Now that, as an economic incentive, might or might not motivate farms to actually keep these trees. Why bother with everything else? And that's really, that's a question that I ask myself all the time. We've chosen to do things in this way, but, maybe it's not the most cost-effective way to do it.
I think the journey to sustainability is long and hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have to take a baby step first.
Mm-hmm.
And the baby step might be that you pay people for the trees that they grow on their farms.
Mm-hmm.
And when they realize that climate is getting a little bit more stable and a little bit more dependable and so on, they might want to keep the trees themselves and not really worry you for anything more. I do believe it was Maneka Gandhi who first said this at an international forum. She said it's all very well for you Western farmers having pretty much taken care of 1/7/8 of the world into unsustainable practices. You're asking the rest of us to follow, to take care of the environment for you guys. So you have to pay us for it. And I think that's where it started.
So that's actually also how carbon credits are sold, right? So countries can sell them. And a lot of communities, local communities in rural India will maintain forests, whether it's community forest or whatever, and sell those carbon credits to companies in California. So in the California sort of carbon market. So that's how it is. So countries that can't afford to do whatever, keep forests or keep carbon sinks will sell it and so on and so forth.
I think you've touched on some really important questions that are being asked all around the world. And I think that there's a lot of debate about whether consumers can actually ever also be political actors in the act of only consuming, right? And so I think that that's an important thing to add, and that goes with your conversation about certifications, right? And I appreciated your point about the fact that maybe that certifications haven't taken hold in India to the extent that they have in the US or Europe or other parts of the world. That might leave open space for other kinds of more local solutions. So I think your question about, well, is it better just to pay for the trees, or is it better to do this whole really great thing you're doing, but also really a lot of work that you're doing? I mean, I think that that's the kind of question that has to be asked exactly because it's local in a lot of ways. So I don't have an answer to that, but just to say that it's a good question.
But I think you should introduce yourself because you're in some ways dealing exactly with this.
Yeah, I'm Camille Fraser. I'm a PhD student in the US at UCLA in Los Angeles, but I'm in Bangalore for a year doing research on sustainable agriculture in Bangalore, given that the city has grown so quickly in such a short period of time. What are people doing to get food in ways that are sustainable, but also for farmers to produce food in ways that are sustainable? So these questions are all really important.
But I mean, I think your point about consumers being political actors is something we don't think about, right? So this is, so in the place where I worked in Coog, every time we talked about certification and said that, actually if you follow certain practices, your coffee will be sold in the US as being certified coffee and so on, people turned around and said, hey, I don't want my picture on a coffee packet as a poor farmer. I'm not a poor, uneducated farmer. I know how to manage my crop. So, I mean, in some ways, we sell images, we sell poverty, we sell helpless farms as a way of selling our products, and that's politics right there, right? I mean, people don't always like it.
If you see history, certain food items were commoditized at every period of time. Even potato, for example, was not a staple food at a time. It was again. So, and even coffee, from the history that you mentioned, might not be there about 500-600 years back. I mean, so now if it's significant, then we need to understand the story behind it. And as consumers, we don't look into the next level of a consumption. Now if you're saying about organic or practices, it's because we no longer use our hands for anything. In terms of, that's one definition of organic for me, how closest can the human body get to my consumption in terms of maybe packaging or harvesting. The farther I am, the more non-organic I'm getting. So as a consumer, we need to keep questioning ourselves, like, what is the story for this particular bean? Where is this bean coming from? Why is it coming from? Where it's coming? Then I can make a choice. So right now, I think we are in a generation where there's choices, which we never had before. Today, when we have 3 different types of coffee in front of me, and we might have not had this about a couple of years back. So as consumers, we need to question the choices that we have and keep thinking about that's one way of being a little more responsible, is what I believe.
So, as an interesting aside, again, thanks very much for your point. With organic coffee, I find personally, this is my take. My fellow colleague Nisarg, who works on otters actually along coffee plantations, may disagree. But my take is that often, if I had to look at what sustainability means and what I want out of farm, organic farms in some ways, in my opinion, do worse than non-conventional farms, because organic farm, organic production often for coffee, this is only for coffee and this is only in the landscape that I work in. You find that actually production goes down anyway when people are growing organic coffee. So what they do is they get rid of the trees, because the fastest way to boost productivity is to get rid of trees. So you find farms that use some chemicals actually more sustainable than farms that use no chemicals. So I think what you're saying is that there's a nuance, there's a story, and that story is very context specific. It's specific only to part of Coorg in India. That might not be true elsewhere.
But even in conservation, if you look at it, there is a struggle between different parts of conservation. From coffee to elephants to, you showed it's a leopard, I believe, a leopard. Otter, and the pictures. So there's always a conflict between different sustainable conservational methods. Mm-hmm. Where is your struggle leading you to?
Oh yeah, no, conservationists haven't figured it out. I think we disagree way more than any other.
Because someone will say that elephants were much before than coffee. Somebody's going to say this is a land in which some species were like the trees. Not many of the trees that we have in Bangalore are indigenous. So we're going to this question of which is older, which is new, which is needed, which is
thanks again. One of my big fears is, so let's say we start conserve, let's say our method works and we end up conserving biodiversity, and what you find is that plantations where we work actually see more elephants, right? What happens when there are more elephants in a farm? There's potentially more conflict with workers who are picking coffee. Elephants eat coffee, so this time when we went, we found a lot of coffee beans in elephant dung. So actually there's a cost there as well that we hadn't anticipated. So it's an unanticipated cost of conservation. How do we explain that to farmers?
Hi, I'm Adeep. I'm from Coorg, so probably a different perspective. As compared to like 15 years ago, we had like a lot of secondary crops merged with coffee. Alright, so it wasn't just coffee, it wasn't just silver oak, because in my grandfather's estate, I still remember there were a lot of jackfruit, like a lot of orange plants. So don't you think like if you promote like secondary crops as a financial incentive rather than coffee as your main plant? Mm-hmm. Because I've seen it, all right? Because I've seen my grandfather chop down a lot of trees saying it's good for coffee cultivation. But at the same time, like the oranges went down, the jackfruits went down. So can't you like project that, if I plant this kind of tree too, you will be some sort of like benefited economically?
Absolutely. I think that's a really relevant point. And the thing is not just with trees. So, honey parts of this landscape were really important. What we find is that by removing trees, what you've also done is completely gotten rid of all of the honey production. The honey production has come down dramatically. So Coorg honey used to be so famous. There used to be so much of it. And now there's just very little Coorg honey left, right? So it doesn't have to be just coffee. It can be a mixed bag of different sorts of things. So all products coming out of a farm that follow sustainable practices, whether it's oranges, jackfruit, kokum, that's another big one. Pepper, of course. Pepper's a little tricky, but pepper, and then things like honey.
Right now, with the kind of work that you're doing and the fact that you're working with coffee plantations in Coorg, and you're like producing these sort of boutique coffees, that I feel like the audience for that is a lot smaller than everybody else who drinks instant coffee. So wouldn't it sort of make more sense to get, say, a bigger company like a Nescafe and things like that to start doing producing sustainable coffee, which then means the mass audience gets educated, versus, because I feel like this kind of coffee, it's very few drinkers, people who really appreciate coffee and therefore have the sensibilities to think about where the bean is coming from and really care about that little fair trade logo and stuff, versus a Nescafe.
No, I agree. What you're saying is this too elite to really make a difference, right? And I think that's like bang on. I think a lot of our efforts, even with certifications and so on, become sort of so targeted at urban, educated, elite people that we don't really end up having an impact at the kind of scale we want to. So I think that's right. Whether I want to approach someone like, like a big company, whether it's Nestle or Starbucks or whatever, I have my reason for no, and it's not just that I'm biased. So what we find with certifications is that, actually a lot of these, almost all of the big five, they call it. So that's Nestle, Kraft Foods, Sara Lee, Chibo, and Starbucks. So these are the big coffees that you find across the world. They're all certified. So all of them claim they make, source, and sell sustainable coffee, right? And I've had conversations with people at Nestle or wherever else about, you're calling yourself sustainable, but when you actually look at the bottom, people don't really benefit and the environment doesn't really benefit. There's almost no response, right? The response is, we're selling larger volumes this year than we did last year, so clearly this is how. See, the thing is, with coffee, I think there's the harmonizing production with sustainability just doesn't happen. So I think inherently it's not economically possible to grow coffee in a sustainable way. If you follow sustainable practices, you will face a drop in yield. Now, when you have to trade volumes of the level and the kind, the megatons that you have to, if you're Nestle or whatever, you don't want to endanger your volumes in any way. So telling them, actually, so let's say Nestle sources coffee from Chikmagalur, and I tell them, don't source from any farm. Source from farms that keep 100 trees, maintain 60% shade cover, whatever. They're just not going to meet their volumes. Right? So this becomes the problem every time you're talking to a big coffee magnate. If you talk about sustainability, they don't meet their volumes. So the sort of inherent sort of disconnect between volumes of coffee and sustainable practices, I think brings about a problem there. So in some ways, sustainable coffee is only limited edition. You can only take out so many bags or so many kgs if you want to follow a certain practice. So there's something called the Agri-Payment Scheme, which is the largest sustainable agriculture scheme in the world. So it's implemented all across Europe, mostly sort of Central and Eastern Europe. So farms in Hungary, Romania, whatever, they are certified again under this scheme, and then whatever comes out of the farm, whether it's dairy, cheese, whatever else, is sort of called a high nature value product. So they don't just certify one thing, but they certify the farm in general, which is an interesting thing. With regard to cooperatives and unions, we find that in India, so everywhere else, almost everywhere else where coffee is grown, people have been really good at coming together as cooperatives. Somehow in India we haven't done that, and I don't know why that's the case, but we've just been very bad at forming cooperatives in India with regards to tea and coffee and other plantation.
What is the role of the coffee board?
The coffee, so pre-liberalization, right? So 1991, before 1991, the coffee board used to be the sole marketer of coffee. So as a farmer, I'd sell my coffee to the coffee board. There'd be one price. The coffee board would pool together all of the coffee that farms in India produce and then sell it onwards. Post-liberalization, the coffee board's role is just research and development. So if I want a new variety of coffee, if I want to use a certain kind of fertilizer and so on, that's the information I get from the coffee board. That's also mixed feelings. Some people are really happy about the fact that, I think people felt that the coffee board used to really heavily control prices. So I think people are really happy. In fact, I think a lot of the coffee growers sort of lobbied for the dissolution of the coffee board. So people have been really happy because they feel or they perceive that they've received higher prices. So in that sense, regulations are also interesting, right? So coffee is one of those commodities that's not a food commodity. So it's not. So it's sold on the futures market. which means that I can speculatively trade on coffee. But all of the agreements that it's also very neoliberal, right? So a lot of the agreements that used to govern how coffee was traded globally have been dissolved since 1989. So you had an international coffee agreement where all of the countries got together and sort of said that we wouldn't stock coffee, we wouldn't hoard coffee or maintain a surplus or whatever just in order to regulate prices. That's been dissolved. So now you see a lot more stocking, hoarding, all that. So coffee is one of the most volatile commodities in the market. It's also the second most highly traded commodity only after petroleum. So I think $60 billion a year just after petroleum. So the most highly valued commodity. So people call it black gold and like that.
Like we've been talking about coffee yields, increasing with sunlight, right?
Mm-hmm.
Has there been steps taken to find out a variety that produces the same yield under the shade as well? Do you think it would move in that direction, given like the level of technology that we've reached with mutations and?
Yeah, that hasn't happened yet. See, the thing is that it hasn't happened, and perhaps we've been sitting around. Perhaps that information can only come from the Coffee Board of India. So the thing is that, like in the Americas, where basically the coffee markets, research, trading, growing, production, everything is far more sophisticated. That's where a lot of investment into research and so on goes on, right? Because they produce most of the coffee. They're really I think we're the fifth largest producer, but our coffee somehow, Indian coffee isn't as highly valued. So it's not really sold as premium coffee though. People don't really want it. So we haven't, I think, been able to push our agenda in this whole discussions that happen on research and so on. So the answer to your question is no, we don't have a variety that can produce the same amount under shade.
One more question, alright. Now we've been talking about coffee as a crop, but don't you think the way we make coffee, like say for an example an espresso, we go to coffee day, we see a guy ramming a whole bunch of coffee powder. So what happens to the waste? Can't we reuse the waste in some another way?
It's supposed to be pretty good compost.
Yeah, it is. No, I mean not compost, but I still believe that there's about 30% flavor left, right, in the espresso. And what we get, according to what we hear, is about 15% flavor. So don't you think that could be reused in some other way to make instant coffee too?
I'm sure it could be. I mean, I don't know. I don't have the answer to your question, but I certainly think yes. There's a lot of wastage, and there's a lot of innovation that can go around to try and get as much as we can from as little as possible.
So I mean, byproducts can be as an economical source in that sense.
Yeah. So people use things like you'd know people use the
pulp as
husk and pulp of coffee as fertilizer. So that's one way, but.
As I see, there are two end users. One is we who are drinking coffee, and the other one's the farmer. So you work with a bunch of farmers in Coorg, and how has their reaction been? Do they appreciate it at all? Are they spreading the word, or what's their participation been like?
So I'll tell you the honest answer. The honest answer, I think it's too early to say. It hasn't been too difficult to get people's attention, and that's partly because I started, as I said, my work as a researcher. So when I started talking to people about this, I talked to them for 3 years before that about how they were growing coffee, what they were putting into coffee, what the history of their farm was, and so on and so forth. So I think the sort of trust already existed, that they didn't really see this project as being an outright business sort of venture. So I think that certainly helped. I think there's a lot of trust about what the sort of purpose of this is. The other thing is, I think what happens is that when you go into a farm and say, okay, you can't cut the branches of the forest trees you have to let things be, or you have to not cut the trees down on your farm or whatever. It takes a while for people to feel the pinch in drop in productivity. So I think we bought ourselves some time. So it's been 2.5 years, and I don't think yields have dropped that much. So what's happened is, for the past 2.5 years, nobody has cut the branches. So you saw that picture that just looked like a tree stump with a clump of leaves on top, right? So now it's actually spread out. So they look like trees. But people haven't yet that faced a drop in yield. So I think we bought ourselves some time. That's, I think, the honest sort of answer to your question. But the other thing I will say is that, okay, so again, the way that coffee is sold in India is that as a farm, I have no idea what happens to my coffee outside it leaves the gate, right? So I can be a conscientious, good farmer that invests a lot of money, time, capital into really looking after my trees, or I can be a really neglectful farmer who's just sort of doing it as is. And there's nothing that differentiates the coffee of my farm and my neighbors, right? In price, in recognition, in visibility, we're all just sold to the local trader who just sells it on to whoever. What has happened after we started our work is that now you have something called single estate coffees. So someone who grows coffee that is in the Aspire to Water blend has the person drinking coffee from the Aspire to Water blend knows exactly which plantation it comes from. And I think that counts a lot. I mean, we talk only about economic incentives and the fact that farms need to be sort of incentivized financially or whatever, but we miss out on all the non-economic things that actually make or support plantations to do what they do. And I think this makes a big difference. So some amount of recognition and visibility, actually I think that's really, I think, what's given us the most sort of response of positive feedback, attraction with people. It's saying we're not just going to lump your coffee with all of the other mud. We'll actually take it, look at it, improve quality, work with you to improve quality, and then market it as single estate coffee.